So the spaced learning method, the total immersion method, this book, that book, the 3,000 core words, Duolingo, internet is awash with self-proclaimed language learning experts, coaches, and every single one will tell you that their method is the only method. Now, as many of you have probably noticed from watching other content I've done, I don't really get involved in that kind of field of language learning. Obviously, I enjoy learning languages. I've spent my life learning languages. And people do ask me from time to time, what is my technique when it comes to learning a language? Do I have a particular strategy that I employ when learning a language? So in this video, I'm going to try and break down the way I conceive language learning and the way I generally approach any particular language that I'm learning at a given time. So with the myriad of language learning solutions that we have on the internet, be it coaching sessions, online lessons, AI and various other solutions, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact the purpose of learning and using a language on a very, very basic level is just simply to speak to somebody who speaks that language, for them to understand you, and then for you to be able to understand what they say and reply. And it really is that simple. That's the end game of learning any language. And anything in between not knowing the language at all and reaching that end game are just so many shades of grey. So let's start with the building blocks of any particular language that we want to learn. The three building blocks really are going to be pronunciation, how the way you speak the language sounds to the person you're speaking to, grammar, or what we call in aviation English structure, which is just basically the way that you put the sentences together, and vocabulary, which is just basically words which mean things. So let's start with pronunciation. The most important thing to bear in mind when you're learning pronunciation in any language is that you don't have to be perfect in order for people to understand you. That being said, your pronunciation still needs to be within an understandable range of variation. And to illustrate that, if we take a particular term in English, let's think of a place in New York. So let's say I arrive at Kennedy Airport in New York, I get into the back of a taxi and I say to the taxi driver, take me to Brookline Bridge. It's likely the taxi driver is not going to understand what I'm saying. If I pronounce it in a way that's more intelligible to a speaker of the language, then it's probably going to be easier for them to understand. So if I get in the taxi and say Brooklyn Bridge, people are still going to understand me, even though they'll probably know that I'm not a native speaker of English. I do think people, though, when they start learning a language, they don't put enough emphasis on clarity of pronunciation. And once again, I'm not talking about sounding like a native speaker, which 99% of the time most people are not going to achieve and is not really necessary in order to communicate. But what you do need to do is think about how words, when you see them written on a piece of paper, being able in your brain to then say to yourself, right, in my brain, I think that word should sound like that. And if I can make that link between a word I don't know and the way I think in my head it's supposed to be pronounced, then I should also be able to then produce that word fairly easily. So in order to achieve this, there are two things you can do. You can listen to any kind of audio source of the language that you're learning, be it a radio station, a podcast, a film. Even if you don't understand 90% of what you're hearing, it's training your ear to make you think about how certain sounds generally should sound. And then it's the way your brain interprets them and is then able to reproduce them in a conversation. One of my favorite sites for this is Forvo, which is a website where people upload pronunciations of particular words. And it's very useful when you're going to start using a new word for the first time and you've never heard it before. But one thing I will say is that in order to sound clear all of the time when you're speaking a language which is not your own, it requires a concerted effort, almost like somebody who's in the theatre, who's doing diction lessons. You really need to focus on the articulation of every single sound that you produce. And the more you do that, the more natural you will sound. It's one of my favourite techniques that I use when I'm learning a language and I want to practice pronouncing something, is I will actually treat it almost as a sort of a theatrical exercise. And you can do this with anything you've got lying around the house. So let's take, for example, this bottle of engine oil that I found hanging around the hangar, which is just next to my office on the airfield where I'm based. I have on the back a description in various different languages of what the oil is. So what I can do is I can use a theatrical approach and over-project the sounds, which helps my brain to tune in to the way certain words are supposed to be pronounced. Huile minérale sans cendre avec agent de dispersion pour moteur à piston d'avion. Minerale asloze olie met dispergeermiddel voor vliegtuigzuigermotoren. Mineral ashless dispersant oil for aircraft piston engines. Vocabulary, quite important as well. See, the more words you know for things, the more you're going to be able to express yourself easily in your target language. Now, this is probably the only thing for me where apps like Duolingo are useful, because they allow you to learn a broad spectrum of different words from domains that you probably wouldn't have thought about. They're not really much use, these apps, I mean, for learning to speak, but what they do is provide you with a source of new vocabulary. And when you're at the very beginning, any kind of words really are quite useful just to kind of start to put things together in your mind and make you able to communicate, even if it's just on a basic level. Another thing that's really useful, and something that I quite often do, and I still do now in all of my working languages, is if I know I'm going to go into a particular domain and I'm going to need certain vocabulary, and it's not something I talk about every day, is I might watch on YouTube a documentary about that particular thing. So let's say I need to go and buy some hardware from a shop because I'm doing some home improvements. I'm terrible at DIY and I never really talk about that kind of thing. But if I was in Holland, or if I was in Bordeaux where I live here, and I needed some particular thing, what I tend to do is I look on YouTube and I'll find a documentary about home improvements in the language that I want to use, and I'll just listen to it. And I'll pick out all the useful words and phrases that I'm likely to need as part of what I'm trying to do. And this is also a technique that interpreters, professional interpreters, use when they're preparing for an interpreting mission in a domain that they don't often talk about. So this is very, very useful. Even people who are, shall we say, bilingual speakers of a particular language, they're always going to be missing some kind of vocabulary. Structure or grammar. Obviously, in order to make intelligible sentences in any language, we need to know how the sentences are put together. Now, my favourite way of starting with any language is just to learn the absolute basics. And generally in my head, the basics are a subject, a verb, and an object. And being able to do that in the past tense, the future tense, and obviously the present tense. The other one that's very important in the beginning is to learn how to put questions together. So the way that we move words around in different languages in order to create questions. So once I'm able to use the present, past, and future just for basic sentences in my head, and also to ask questions, the rest of it I can really kind of slot together as time goes by. But on a communicative level, those four things are really quite important. If you can learn that from the very beginning in any language, you can start communicating. And you can then start to fill in the blanks later. So after you've learned all your passive knowledge about a particular language, there always comes a key moment in your language learning journey or process, or whatever you want to call it. And that is moving from just knowing a bit of the language to actually starting to use it. And the willpower to start doing that can only come from you. You can learn as much vocabulary, grammar as you want, but there comes a point where in your mind, you've got to talk to somebody. You've got to just be in front of someone and ask them something. Now, in certain cultures, particularly in France, where people are generally quite judged, for example, on their level of French, that kind of mentality can then extend itself into learning another language because you're afraid of sounding ridiculous. When somebody who's not a native speaker of your native language speaks to you, even if they completely mangle the language, even if they make loads and loads and loads of grammar mistakes, most of the time you can still understand them. And it works the other way in any other language. As long as what you are saying is reasonably intelligible, pretty much anything goes. And once you've got over that complex of worrying about sounding ridiculous in the language, that's 90% of the work done. Because once in your mind you've got it into your head that you will speak and people will understand you, you'll just carry on speaking. And every time you get into a situation where you don't know how to say something, your brain will automatically try and put the bits together to create a clear message. The next thing is how good you want to get at the language. And this really depends on your own mentality. Some language learners will reach the stage where they're just able to communicate, and that will be enough for them. They won't make an awful lot of effort to eliminate grammar errors or have a clearer pronunciation. In my mind, I have quite an obsessive personality when it comes to languages, and I just want to constantly learn new words, new ways of saying things, new expressions. So I spend a lot of time listening to people speaking the language. I'll listen to people in a restaurant, for example. I'll just kind of tune my ear in, and I'll note any kind of expressions, make a mental note of any kind of expressions that I like. And then later on, I can go and look them up, and I think, oh, I like that expression. I'm going to try and use it the next time I speak to somebody in Dutch. And the key thing as well, when you want to improve, when you talk to people, listen to how they respond to you. If you ask a question, and when they answer the question, they reformulate it in a slightly different way, it may be a kind of a subconscious way to eliminate a particular mistake that you've been making. So always listen to the people when they respond to you and make a mental note of how they say it, particularly native speakers, because then the next time you're in that situation, you can remember in your head, oh, I remember last time I tried to say this and the guy corrected me and said, oh, you mean this. And going through thousands of situations like that really is how you improve. Another thing that you really need when you reach a certain communicative level in a language is just quite simply somebody to speak to. Somebody who speaks the language, ideally a native speaker, but doesn't need to be, but somebody who is patient enough to let you speak to them in that language every time you see them and get into the habit of only using that language with that person. Now, this allows a couple of things. It allows you to bounce your language use off somebody who really speaks the language well. It allows you, in your mind, to speak to someone and know that you're going to be understood. A lot of the nerves around language learning come from the fact that when you speak to somebody, you might be worried that they won't understand what you're saying. But somebody who is used to hearing you speak the language in your own way is kind of tuned into it, so you can speak naturally and you can just produce a lot of content. And I remember 10, 15 years ago, when I was in the process of learning French, I had a couple of people who I spoke to on a very regular basis. And a lot of people actually told me that the way I spoke French actually was very similar to the way that one of these people actually spoke themselves.
Eh bien bonjour, bonjour à tous, bonjour à tous mes abonnés. Me voici de retour pour une nouvelle vidéo. Et cette fois-ci, comme vous pouvez le constater, je ne suis pas seul.
En effet.
En effet, je vous présente, j'ai l'immense honneur de vous présenter Monsieur Alexis Dubrul, qui est professeur de français et qui est l'un de mes principaux référents en langue française. Donc Alexis, est-ce que tu peux te présenter un petit peu et expliquer comment on s'est rencontrés, comment ça s'est passé en fait?
Oui, alors comme tu l'as déjà dit, je m'appelle Alexis Dubrul. Voilà, donc je suis professeur de français langue étrangère, FLE, hein, pour les spécialistes, enfin, et moins spécialistes, mais donc le français langue étrangère qui est le français enseigné aux étudiants étrangers, souvent un public plutôt, je dirais, de personnes qui viennent volontairement pour apprendre notre langue.
So thank you very much, Alexis, for your cameo appearance. So if we come back again to the real basics of learning a language, you cannot improve in a language unless you speak it regularly with real people. It sounds a bit boring, sounds a bit oversimplified, but the bottom line is that you can create as many fancy language guides or language techniques, coaching workshops or whatever fancy flowery name you want to call them. It comes down to, if I'm in front of someone and I need to communicate in the language, can I do it? And that essentially is what any kind of language learning comes down to.